50 years ago, midnight struck and brought independence to India. August 15, 1947, British rule ended, and the world's largest experiment in democracy began. One half-century later, a land overflowing with people and language and religion and culture remains one nation, yet it is also a country of poverty and disease, illiteracy and violence. Joining me now to celebrate and reflect on India at 50, author Salman Rushdie. His 1981 novel, Midnight Children, paved the way for Indian writing and English literature. His latest book, Mirror Work, is an anthology of Indian writing since the independence. Author Arundhati Roy contributed to the collection. Her book, The God of Small Things, is one of the best-received Indian novels of the year. And Barbara Cressette, she is the New York Times United Nations Bureau Chief here in New York. She was previously a correspondent based in New Delhi. She wrote a book in 1993, India Facing the 21st Century. I am pleased to have them here, not only to talk about writing and culture, but the politics, all of which is part of what they have either observed or felt or written about, as India, as I've just been paused to note, is already into its 50th year, because there are X number of hours ahead of us. Tell me what this means to India, this time, if anything.
Probably not much, is the truth, is the answer. But I mean, I just think it is, because for some reason, this particular Golden Jubilee seems to have attracted vast international attention. I mean, I think rather...
let me just show as you say this. This is Boston Globe, which I picked up this morning. India's half-century, still a work in progress. The nation looks inward. The Washington Post, free but bound by their past. 50 years after independence, India and Pakistan face the same ills. And here in the New York Times, India's 5 decades of progress and pain. 50 years past midnight.
Yeah, well, I think this is interesting, you see, because I mean, in the years that I've been coming to the United States, talking about books in India and so on, one of the things which has been a kind of truism that people would say is, actually, you know, people in America really not interested in India. You know, and I mean, I would say, well, in that case, who's reading my books? You know, because you know, somebody is.
Yeah.
But that was a kind of a knee-jerk thing that people would say about that there wasn't between America and India any of the intrinsic interest that there is, for example, between Britain and India. You know, and I think, I mean, the thing that's interesting about this is it's as if that's changed. You know, and I mean, there have been various things that I've noticed about just through coming here about with my books and having other Indian writers' books come out. You know, the kind of, I mean, Arundhati's book, you know, which had this wonderful reception here as everywhere else, and it just seems that maybe that connection has been made, you know, between the United States and India, and if so, that is a valuable outcome, I guess.
You just came from India when? This week?
Yeah, about a week ago.
Not much celebration, not much taking note of this 50th anniversary?
Well, I think there's, you know, India has, I keep saying it lives in several centuries simultaneously, and they're always arguing with each other, but I think in India there's a sense that this euphoria is sort of manufactured by the media, by the BBC. The BBC's all over, you know, they've built a special studio, and in the Indian papers, I think the headlines are not about 50th anniversary, but more about the politics of despair almost that is happening there now. And also the fact that, you know, for instance, the British Council in India has a letterhead which says, Britain celebrates the 50th anniversary of Indian independence. And there's this sort of peculiar irony in that, you know, you think, is this some kind of sadomasochistic? What are you celebrating?
Britain celebrates the end of the empire.
But because independence and colonialism are things which are very complex in India. Independence came with you know, the massacre of 1 million people in living memory for us. And colonialism and the ghosts of colonialism are things that we are still fighting. And there's such fierce argument about the fact that, say, 6 or 7 years ago, the Indian economy opened up, Indian television opened up and welcomed, you know, the bold and the beautiful and Santa Barbara and McDonald's and this huge sort of middle-class euphoria about the economy opening up and welcoming in something different. Well, welcoming in the West and fighting it at the same time. So it's such a complicated situation to be in India just now.
Barbara. I want to come back to the cultural and the political element.
Maybe,
Right.
I'll pick up on the American
please.
side. I think several things have happened. For one thing, as Salman has suggested, Americans had no history with India as the British did. So I find here a complete lack of sort of background knowledge, except for a certain amount of romanticism. The same sort of things that I think this is changing now because there are more Indians coming here to live, to go to universities, to take part in politics. I read the local Indian newspaper in the States and published in New York. And it's also a very interesting time in India because, you know, well, it seemed like generations, I guess it was, decades, it was the Congress Party. It was a sort of, we knew their foreign policy. We kind of knew where India stood. We recognized the characters. And all of a sudden in the last few years, because of the the inner dynamics of this, what you talked about, the sort of depression about politics, and a lot of things have opened up, not just the economy, but thinking about politics, and everything is now in action, the courts in India, the electoral system, building a new India. So really, I think it's incredible, in fact, marvelous that at 50, you know, we really have this new India to look at, and I think that's reflected a bit also, and I think that's beginning to attract people here, also because it has a chance for a new relationship with Pakistan, perhaps for the first time in a long time.
I want to get to, from all of you, whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about the future of this country. Should we say the fact that India has held itself together has been its toughest challenge and a miracle that it has over these 50 years, when you think of all the diversity that's there and all of the potential to split apart?
I think that's probably true. You know, I mean, I don't think, in my memory, I can't really think of a moment at which it was credibly on the cards that India would split apart. You know, I mean, actually, I think the surprising resilience of the country, you know, has been there throughout, you know, and I think there have been moments of terrible crisis. But the idea that the country would disintegrate, I think, you know, Pakistan is a country which you could talk about as one which has been, I mean, actually has disintegrated. It started off as a larger country which split into two, and even in what is now Pakistan, what used to be West Pakistan, great internal pressures between the Pathans in the north, the Balochis in the west, the Sindhis in the south, you know, separatist pressures. I mean, leaving aside Khalistan in the Khalistan movement of a Sikh homeland and Tamil pressure in the south, there hasn't been a credible movement to split the country, I would say. There have been such rhetorical statements and some terrorist acts, but I don't think there was ever a moment where I thought the country would split. So that is, I mean, it just does exist. You know, it just is there, and it does exist, and it ain't going to break up. In fact, maybe the opposite's going to happen. I mean, there is some...
It'll consolidate into...
Well, you know, anti-partition, unpartition. Yeah. I mean, I don't, by which I don't necessarily mean political union. You know, but this, I mean, I remember what the oldest object I possessed, I was given on the day I was born by my father's best friend, is a block of silver on which is engraved the unpartitioned map of India. You know, the real India, you know, the big place. And that's what I think of. That's what I think of, you know.
When you think of India, that's what you think of?
Yes, yes. I mean, when I was editing this anthology, I decided to ignore the frontier. You know, if there are Pakistani writers, I'd like to put them in. You know, I thought, why
so we have Pakistani writers in here?
Yes, sure. Why should I partition the literature just because that happened? You know, and that's what it seemed to me. And I think we were talking earlier today that there do seem to be moves to create not a reunion of the country, not like Germany, but a kind of looser federation. You know, they're talking about 10 years from now dropping tariff barriers. I mean, it's a long time away. You know, I don't think it's going to happen the day after tomorrow. But it does seem, if one's looking optimistically, to think that, you know, 50 years from now we might talk about partition as a blip, you know, instead of as something irrevocable. I mean, this is, if you,
okay,
you know,
while I'm
for the
staying
positive.
on politics, what about this battle about secularism and that whole issue in the psyche of India?
Well, actually, you know, I don't... I would love to feel the way you feel, because it's the right, you know, it's the right way to feel, and many of us do wish that this didn't exist, this barrier between India and Pakistan. But what I think, I mean, maybe it's just a perspective from living there and seeing what happens. The fact is that what is happening is peculiar. You know, on the one hand, you have this sort of internet culture. I see it as internet culture, you know, where you have MTV and television and all this. And below that, you have tribalism. You have, you know, whether the country is together just politically or not, it's like, you know, saying, oh, you have a marriage, but whether it's a good marriage or a bad marriage is the point, you know. And I often say that there isn't a single Indian who can claim not to belong to some minority if they want to. So the paths that these cracks take keep changing. You know, sometimes it's Muslim Hindu, sometimes it's Sikh Hindu, sometimes it's caste, sometimes it's language. And you can't predict what's going to happen because it's just under this pressure. And the pressure is not whether the country will break up or not, but the fact that the way politics is working now, each political party seeks to drive in its stakes into some kind of ethnic, or, you know, it seeks to claim some kind of ethnic group or religion, and it plays out this horrible drama all the time.
One of the reasons why I think people like me were so upset about many reasons why we were upset about the emergency of Mrs. Gandhi in the middle 70s, was that it did seem to be the moment at which all the restraints were removed from the system. You know, suddenly the Congress Party would overtly play religious sectarianism as a political card. You know, suddenly the civil service, which had been independent of the political parties and had been a kind of solid base for democracy in India, was deliberately subverted, and political patronage was routed through the Congress Party, and suddenly corruption exploded. You know, I mean, corruption has always been there in India, but that moment is the moment at which it went nuclear.
Also, right here, though, you can jump to really the next issue, which is the social problems of India. If we were going to talk later on about the future, for example, when I went to the sort of trial run of the Ayodhya attack the year before they actually pulled the mosque down in that northern city, and there were people there who were involved in the name of Hinduism attacking this, and we drove some of them back to Lucknow afterwards. They were unemployed kids from Bombay who had been told if they came up and joined the crowd. The political parties are drawing on, for want of a better word, mobs or hooligans, to not just as vote banks that they can count on, but also to get out and demonstrate and so on. And as long as there's this huge population of people without an adequate income in the poorest states, it does lend itself even more to this kind of behavior, and allows politics to really become sometimes a very frightening business. I was at Mrs. Gandhi's funeral in 1984 and at Rajiv Gandhi's funeral in 1991, and the qualitative difference of the atmosphere was extraordinary between 84, when people were perhaps not wildly torn with grief at her death, but were respectful, were dignified, and by the time of Rajiv's funeral, there were Congress Party squads of goons out running around, jumping into places they shouldn't be. And this is what people in India call the Congress culture, among other things.
But you know, I think that for me, one of the most frightening things about what happened with the BJP was, yes, of course, they had this lumpen hooligan element, but you know, there were people who I would meet every day who I would never have suspected would nurse this kind of hatred. And I was sitting in my house and telling people, get out of my house, don't talk to me, yes. don't even bring this up, you know, take your food and eat it outside, because it was so scary that you're talking about educated intellectual people who harbor this kind of prejudice that surfaces, yes, suddenly.
Well, that's why the rest of the neighborhood doesn't want to hear about the greater India. Yes. Because it's this group that very often articulates that, and so to a Pakistani that means a Hindu, Mahabharata.
Yes, I mean, as I say, I wasn't talking about political reunion. I was talking about some kind of economic arrangements, you know, which might just lower the boundaries and allow people to spend less money on guns and more on schools.
And more cultural exchange. There's no excuse for the way it is.
The fear, you know, for instance, yes, we have a free press in India, but you also have writers and painters and artists who know their place, you know, because of what happened with Salman, or, you know, last year they burnt down Hussein's paintings. And it's almost as if now people will not be willing to risk saying things that they wish to say.
And what's happened to your book?
To my book, well, it's, you see, the advantage that I have in my book is that it offends everybody a little bit, you know, so as long as everybody's offended, you're more or less safe. But a Christian lawyer, a Syrian Christian lawyer who lives in the district that I grew up next to, has filed a criminal suit against me for corrupting public morality. So, it's a private citizen, but the minute it's accepted in a criminal court, it's the state of Kerala versus A. Roy. But
so you have to defend yourself.
yeah, well, that's why I was flying back tonight, because I was supposed to appear in court to seek bail on the 19th. But in the meantime, I appealed against this in the High Court, and the High Court has ordered a temporary stay while they consider whether the case should be kept or quashed.
Well, I'm shifting a little bit to culture, and we'll come back to the politics in a second. Why is it that Indians, and it may be obvious because of the British, feel so comfortable in the English language and use it so well?
Well, I mean, I think the one straightforward answer is that most of the Indian middle class go to what are called English medium schools, where English is the medium of instruction from an early age. I mean, I didn't speak English at home. I mean, my mother tongue was Urdu, and we spoke Hindi, of course, and I started speaking English, when approaching school age. But the schools are very good, and so people learn English. I mean, as to the literary use of English, I mean, I think that is a still developing phenomenon, and I think gathering some steam recently. Yeah. I mean, I don't know, for me, as Arundhati also says, that, the choice to write in English was just simply made by the circumstances of my life. I mean, it's my best language, so I use it.
Your best language means what?
Well, I mean, I speak it better than I speak the other ones.
Okay.
Certainly, I mean, I can write letters to my mother in other languages, but I wouldn't write novel in it. But what I felt was that there is a kind of flexibility in English, which allows it to accommodate other music, and what I thought is that the music of India, of speech, and actually of thought also, and of imagination, is rather different than the way in which people think and speak and dream, in England or in America. And what I wanted to do, and I think many other writers have tried to do this, is to find an English which would allow me to express that, and the great thing about English is it is so flexible. It is so many things that it lets you do that.
Barbara.
It's opened up for all of us who don't read the Indian languages a wonderful world of India.
Okay.
Because the fiction is of such high quality, and there's so much
and how would you explain
diversity.
That, other than the explanation just given by...
The quality? Or
the quality, as well as the facility with English language.
Well, it's a country full of brilliant people, well-educated people with a lot of... And an ability to let India sing. But also there are novels that talk about, for example, a small town administrator, or to try to satirize Indian history. There are novels that talk about family life, that talk about the country, that talk about... There's so many to read, and they're so good, and they're so much better than the translations of a lot of Indian writing in Indian languages. True. But it's still, I think, I don't know, Arundhati would be closer to this. There's still some criticism of people who choose to write in English. Yes, I think that you're somehow letting down your mother tongue.
You didn't know that?
No, of course. No. What I want to say is that I think that when you speak of language, the sad truth is that yes, of course, there are writers who are writing very good books, but there is a language crisis in India too, because there are a lot of us speak more than one language. We speak English, Hindi, and say I speak Malayalam. Now that if you're a writer can strengthen your language, but if you're not, it can break it down. And there are a lot of Indians who don't speak any language properly, which is really frightening. And it isn't actually true that everyone who speaks English in India speaks beautifully and writes beautifully. It isn't the case.
Of course, I know that. But at the same time, take the New Yorker magazine here. I mean, don't make a big case out about this, but the New Yorker magazine devoted an entire issue, which you were part of, to Indian.
Yes, I thought it was a great thing for them to do, because I think it did. That is one of the events of this year, I think, that has really shifted a lot of people's perceptions, about that culture, about that writing, here. I mean, I just think, you know, it's a gift, India, for a writer, because it's because it's inexhaustible, you know, because it's because there is, well, certainly this would be my view, that it's you know, Midnight's Children, for instance, or any of my books. I mean, I have tried to give the illusion that they're writing about the whole thing. You know, and actually, of course, that's a complete fake. I mean, you couldn't, you know, you couldn't write about one street, you know, in 500 pages and get everything in. So that's a kind of sleight of hand. But that sense of the cornucopia, that sense of, you know, the kind of inexhaustible horn of plenty, is. And actually, of many of the things that are, you know, were socially and politically wrong with India, that's to say excessiveness.
Well, larger-than-life characters.
Yes,
India's
yes.
full of larger-than-life
the
characters.
The lack of a middle register, you know,
that's right.
All these things.
But sometimes I react against that, you know, because I think, again, you know, I just think that there are things about India which are just like everywhere else. And I don't, as a writer, I'm not conscious of, you know, people have told me that I do this, but I'm not conscious of actually trying to remodel the English language to tell Indian stories. It's just the way I think, and it's the way I use language, and it's mine, you know. And I think a lot of people who write, maybe, you know, the more recent writers, think that, you know, you're not aware of trying to use a foreign language to tell a native story. You know, I'm not aware of that.
I'm not trying to say English is a foreign language. What I'm trying to say is that I would have thought that most serious writers have a linguistic project. You know, that's to say that if you have to find a language for your work, you know, you have to find.
But that, I think, is true of a writer anywhere. You know, it's not necessarily.
Well, of course it is. I'm just talking about being this writer from here, doing this. You know, of course it's true. It's true of every writer. If you don't hear a unique voice, it's not that interesting a writer. You know, I mean, the writers we remember are the ones that you can remember because they don't write like anyone else. You know, and what I'm saying is that there was a sense in which India allowed me to become the writer that I was, that I could not have become, you know, otherwise. And that does have to do with, I mean, I know this is a book about small things and intimacies and details and so on, and you know, good for it. But I'm saying that there is this other project which excited me, which had to do with taking on the whole damn thing. Yes. You know, and that's what I wanted to do and have tried to do, and I think I've probably finished.
Probably finished taking on the whole damn thing. So that next time the novel will be about a small thing. A large thing, but something else. I'm almost out of time. I want to go to this point. What are you optimistic about when you think of this place that you reported from so well, and what concerns you as one who had to have liked and found great friendship in this country?
Well, I think it being the 50th anniversary and everyone talking about the largest democracy, I think it's amazing that one can go during an election to the smallest village. People are completely unafraid, however beaten down they might be by caste or whatever else, give their names, give their opinions, talk about politics, talk about anything. From the villages on up, Indians are politically astute and aware. And I think this is being translated into non-governmental organizations. That doesn't sound very sexy, but in fact, these are the sort of new political stirrings in some places, it seems. People taking on single issues, we recognize this in our own countries. And in a way, moving to reform politics in some way. I do think there are huge problems in ignoring 300 to 600 million people who aren't making it, particularly in the states of the North, where there are genuine problems with everything, literacy, health, and so on. But there's a core there, and in fact, the English language is also, in many ways, among the emerging middle class, those educated in a certain way. I realize we only talk always about a minority. That's a cohesive factor too, in some ways, and in fact, even sharing these literary ideas, one often learns so much more about. Well, we learn about our own country from novels, poems, things like that, and the English writing is making Indians proud of themselves in a whole new way. I think English art would like to follow. And Indian art would like to follow into this English writing, and so it's created a very dynamic cultural environment in India.
And what's the imperative for India today? What is it that India has to do as it enters the next century?
Has to do. Well, if I had a gun to my head and
Yeah.
I had to say one thing, only one thing, I'd say that it should dismantle its whole sort of grants for higher education and just really concentrate on primary education. I
Because
think
education is key to.
yeah, well, it's just the only thing I can think of that will make people help themselves.
Having a point, if I have to make only one point, reminds me of the opening of this book. Listen, this is Mirrorworks. I once gave a reading. This is Salman. I once gave a reading to a gathering of university students in Delhi, and when I finished, a young woman put up her hand. Mr. Rushdie, I read through your novel, Midnight's Children, she said. It's a very long book, but never mind, I read it, though, and the question I want to ask you is this. Fundamentally, what is your point? Before I could attempt an answer, she spoke, oh, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say that the whole effort from cover to cover, that is the point of the exercise. Isn't that what you're going to say? Something like that, perhaps, I got out. She snorted, it won't do. Please, I begged, do I have to make just one point? Fundamentally, she said, with impressive firmness, yes. She deserves her own show.
It was one of the most impressive lessons in literature I ever learned.
I have this one last question, because I'm a romantic at heart, and I assume all of us are. Not necessarily, because life may have been easier for me than others. There is romance about India. There is mystery about India. There is, for all the poverty, and for all the pain, and for all the violence, there is something that makes it different.
There's immense grace.
Grace.
Grace. Yeah. And a poor Rajasthani woman working on a road construction crew can wear jewelry and a sari in a way that is extraordinary. Everything is arresting. Maybe that sounds patronizing, but for an outsider, it's what makes people who find it difficult to live there go back again and again and again. And not just that, but it's one of those things.
Would you give us this from afar?
For me, I think what I value most about India is the depth of human relationships. I just, I would trade that in for any, I wouldn't trade that in for anything. It's, for me, the central thing.
The gift of friendship.
Friendship and the depth of a relationship. It's not superficial somehow. It's cemented in some way that I can't explain.
Well, I hear what Arundhati is saying, and I agree with it. And I must say, just speaking personally, it makes me feel very sad, because I think I'm coming very close to the end of my relationship with India, because I can't go. It's been almost 10 years since I could go. I don't want to start writing about it in a way that shows that ignorance, and so I think the amount of work I can do in that area is limited. I'm writing, in fact, as it happens, a book at the moment which is about people who leave. About if Midnight's Children was about the dream of home, then this book is about the dream of going away.
It's great cowardice, political cowardice at not supporting him. I mean, his book was, Satanic Verses was banned there before.
Right.
It was banned elsewhere, and there is a certain lack of political.
Yeah, I think it's over for me. I think I feel like the person who got dumped. I mean, Arundhati is saying, is it a good marriage or a bad marriage? In my case, it feels like it's over, or very nearly so.
It's very sad.
Great loss to you. Great loss to. Right.
But it's, as I said, this is the fear that, what happened to Salman has its avatars in all of us. Everybody knows the lines they can't cross now. It's terrible.
No, I intend to go on crossing every possible line.
Yeah, but there...
There's no one that doubts that.
Yeah, but now...
Show me a line.
Show me a line that I can cross. Or that you dare me to cross.
Exactly.
Let me just one more time. Barbara Cressette with the New York Times United Nations correspondent. Arundhati Roy, a book that enormous praise, The God of Small Things, a novel with a cover designed by, guess who? The author. And Mirrorwork, 50 years of Indian writing, 1947 to 1997, edited by Salman Rushdie and Elizabeth West, and includes a lot of names that you would recognize. I thank you. India enters its 51st year. Back in a moment.